Swedish prosecutors have dropped an investigation into a rape allegation made against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange in 2010. Mr Assange, who denies the accusation, avoided extradition to Sweden for 7 years by seeking refuge at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. The 48-year-old Australian was evicted in April and sentenced to 50 weeks in jail in London for breaching his bail conditions. He's fighting extradition to the United States to face charges of leaking classified information.
Expectations, always expecting the Swedish prosecuting service to realise that it's a scandal and a disgrace, their pursuit of Julian over these 9 years.
And Jennifer Robinson is a lawyer on Julian Assange's legal team, and she joins us now from Melbourne. Jennifer Robinson, good morning. So the Swedish prosecutor says this case was dropped because of the passage of time. Why do you believe it was dropped?
Well, the conclusion that was reached by the Swedish prosecutor overnight is the same that was reached by the chief prosecutor back in 2010, that the evidence didn't disclose any crime. This case has dragged on for more than 9 years in circumstances where Julian Assange always expressed his concern that lurking in the background was a US extradition request, which would be unstoppable once in prison in Sweden. That came to pass. He's in prison in London at the moment, facing 175 years in prison for his publishing work with WikiLeaks. That is and has always been our major concern. And I'm pleased that the Swedish investigation after 9 years has finally been dropped. A case that has been described by the UN as abusive process and has undermined his right to be presumed innocent.
What's your view about the motivation with this case from the beginning?
Look, I think it's difficult to speculate on the motivation of the authorities, but certainly to have continued this case for 9 years in circumstances where the chief prosecutor in Stockholm had dropped the case initially because it didn't consider it to be a case to be pursued, and in the circumstances where he has been seeking assurances with respect to US extradition for many years. He offered his testimony. It's been opened and closed 3 times now. It's time that this matter is drawn to a close so that we can focus on the more important issues at hand, which is an extradition request from the United States.
Yeah, and we'll get on to that in a moment, but just one more question on this. Would he have ended up in this position, facing deportation to the US, if this Swedish case had not been filed?
Well, the Swedish case, of course, tied him up in a process for many years, kept him under some form of restriction on his liberty without charge since 2010. It is an unacceptable process, and one that the Swedish prosecutor has been found in breach of her duties numerous times by the Swedish courts, and Sweden in breach of its international obligations by the United Nations. To say that it's an abusive process, I think, is an understatement, and it's important that we can now focus on the free speech issues at issue in Julian's case and the US extradition request.
Okay, so where to from here now? Julian Assange is in a British jail pending a hearing in February on extradition to the US on charges including conspiring to hack government computers and violating an espionage law. What is the state of your preparation and his legal team's preparation for that hearing?
There's a hearing going ahead in February in which Julian's extradition team will be challenging the extradition request. Of course, this case raises serious free speech concerns. To describe it as a hacking case, it misrepresents what this case is about. This is a publisher who is being sought for prosecution in the United States for having dealt with a source in the way that journalists do all the time, having communications with a source and publishing information in the public interest. The publications for which he's been sought for prosecution include those publications that WikiLeaks won the most outstanding contribution to journalism Walkley Award here in Australia, and for which Julian Assange has won the Sydney Peace Prize. This is a very serious matter, and it goes to the heart of free speech protections both in the United States and for journalists and publishers all over the world.
Yeah, so talk us through those laws in a bit more detail that will be discussed at length during this defence.
Well, the preliminary challenge that has already been raised in the UK court is that this is a prosecution for political purposes and political offences. The Espionage Act has been used against a publisher. This is the first time in US history in which the Espionage Act has been used against a publisher. If you look at the allegations, what it boils down to is a publisher and a journalist communicating with a source, requesting that a source give information, and having communications with that source about protecting their identity. As the former editor of The Guardian has said, this is what honourable journalists do all the time. And this is why the New York Times, the Washington Post have described this as a terrifying threat for the First Amendment in the United States, and will put at risk traditional journalism and news gathering activities that are used by mainstream media and journalists all the time.
Are you confident in the independence of the British judiciary in this case?
I'm confident in the independence of the British judiciary. The difficulty is the persecution by the Trump administration of the media. This is an indictment that has come from the Trump administration, who calls the media the enemy of the people. This is an indictment that will put at risk journalists and publishers the world over, and it's right and proper that this be challenged. I think the Australian government needs to start stepping up and raising concern about the fact that an Australian citizen is facing 175 years in prison, more than a life sentence, for publications for which he's won the Sydney Peace Prize. It's time the Australian government starts to raise concerns, both with the United States government and the UK, so that this extradition does not take place.
Yeah, well, some Australian MPs are speaking out about trying to stop an extradition to the US. What have you made of the approach of the Australian government so far?
The Australian government, successive Australian governments since 2010, have failed to raise the concerns that we've requested of them, to seek assurances that he would be protected from this very outcome, to raise their concern about the prosecution of a publisher who's won journalism awards and indeed big awards here in Australia. This is a humanitarian issue. His health is deteriorating, and it's time that the Australian government starts to do what we know they're capable of doing, which is to intervene on behalf of an Australian citizen and bring him home.
What about the argument that he put lives at risk by the allegation is that he recklessly published what he did?
WikiLeaks engaged in a redaction process in partnership with their media organisations that they were working with on each of those publications. To say that they recklessly published is not correct, is a complete misrepresentation, and indeed there is no evidence that anyone has been harmed. The United States government themselves, and indeed the former defence spokesperson Robert Gates, has said that did not damage national security and was merely embarrassing. So for someone to be facing 175 years in prison, in circumstances where we're not sure that anyone has been harmed, and certainly the US government has said in the Chelsea Manning proceedings that national security was not damaged to a significant effect, this is a serious, serious issue.
And Jennifer Robertson, do you know if anyone's been able to pass on this news to Julian Assange yet? Has any member of his legal team or his family been able to actually speak to him?
The last I heard is that no one had yet been able to speak to him. Of course, he is in the most high security prison in the UK. It's difficult to reach him, and I hope he's seen the news headlines.